Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parker.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in sunny Berkeley, California, on a lovely day known as Mayday. And we're excited to be talking to you about Mayday. And as always, I am joined by...
Bob Bazanko. I'm in Studio B today. And happy Labor Day. And to all of you out there, happy Mayday / Labor Day. And the what we always say, thank you. We appreciate it. And please share these and subscribe on YouTube. And we have an email list where you can get all the latest, not just about the podcast, but about things we write. Follow us on all the various social media. If you're on like podcast or Apple or Spotify, you can rate and review, which are great because all those things boost up the algorithms, and pretty soon we'll be up. I think we're getting close to 1 million listeners, so we're almost there. So and also, last week I mentioned that we're in talks to create a movie version of Green and Red podcast, and
it might be an HBO miniseries that we're in talks about.
But word on the street and Variety, I read that Coppola is interested in this now, and he wants to bring De Niro and Duvall back together again as you and me. So you never know. I mean, I'm going to talk to Jim Jarmusch next week for kind of the film noir version of it, and maybe Adam McKay for the hardcore, kind of political version. So I think it may be delayed a bit, like the Many Saints of Newark, but I think someday on a TV screen you're going to see Scott and me, portrayed by some really famous people, and I think we could win Oscars based on what I read about the Oscars the other night.
Yeah, it's all just a PR campaign. So, and we're really good at that. So, also for folks out there, well, first of all, if you do want to get on our email list, check out. You can find the ways to get on it on our website, greenandredpodcast.org, which also has a support button. And if you hit that support button, then you will contribute to this media endeavor, this fantastic media endeavor, which brings you voices and stories and opinions that you don't hear in other places. So go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button for a one-time donation, or you can become a patron at patreon.com/greenandredpodcast. And we're actually, all joking aside, this is actually a growing group of people, the M19 Brigade. We've actually had 2 new patrons in the last week, and want to thank those folks for joining us and supporting the Green and Red podcast. And with that, we can away with our show, which is today is May 1st, May Day. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Mayday. We're going to talk a little bit about the politics, particularly in the, late 19th century, 20th century about Mayday. And then we're going to just riff a little bit about the politics of Mayday and how it plays out in politics today. And so with that, I'm going to actually let Bob start with a little bit of ancient history of Mayday.
Yeah, this is basically, I love telling this story. So this is basically my excuse to find some kind of your nebulous connection to it, because it's one that I actually didn't know about myself until long after I became a historian, because I don't study this period. But Mayday traditionally is I think was a Roman rite to celebrate the beginning of spring, and it has to do with harvesting, and apparently some people call it a fertility rite. So it was always celebrated Mayday, and you would create this big pole, put ribbons and shit and dance around the maypole. And that actually is one of the reasons for one of the first big major protest movements in American history. And that occurred in Massachusetts after the Pilgrims arrived, just a few years after, in 1625. A guy named Thomas Morton showed up, and Thomas Morton has become one of my favorite historical figures. I call him more playboy than Puritan. Morton he was a merchant. He began trading arms and weapons to the Indians, and he also began enjoying Indian women, which was forbidden, and they were, which alarmed the Puritan leaders because he was being immoral, but also because they were trying to destroy the Indians and take their land, which they would eventually do not much longer in the Pequot Massacre, the Pequot Wars, so-called Pequot Wars. But Morton and his followers were also very un-Puritan in the way they lived their lives. And so he put up the traditional Mayday maypole, which is like an 80-foot tall phallic figure with festooned with ribbons and wreaths and attached, kind of as a fertility symbol. And they would dance around it, and the Puritans wrote many days together. They would dance many days together, inviting the Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together like so many fairies or furies. And so these most dismal wretches, the Puritans, I think Cawthorne called them that, had created this May Day celebration in this maypole. And the Puritans hated him because he was rooting this, pure society, right? And so John Winthrop, the governor of Plymouth, had him arrested in 1630 and sent back to England, and they burned his house down. So even though that's not the Mayday we're talking about, I think it's a pretty cool story. And it's a good example of how the ruling class in America this is in 1630, right? Only 10 years after the Pilgrims arrived the Puritans arrived in Plymouth. They are, exiling people, burning their houses down for violating these codes. And it's not just a moral issue. I mean, this guy was trading with Native Americans. He was making money off of them. He was integrating them into this local market. And so Winthrop and the Puritans would have nothing to do with it. In 1637, Morton wrote a book called The New English Canaan, which denounced the colonial leaders and really admired the Indians, the Native Americans. So he's not quite a North American de las Casas, who wrote about Columbus, who traveled with, the Spanish, but it's kind of cool. And the best part of it, I'll leave it at this. This is just basically an excuse for me to talk about Thomas Morton, because I think he's an awesome historical figure, was that at one point he believed that it was difficult to tell who the real wild people were. And he said that in his opinion, it was the Puritans, not the Indians, who were the savages. So, so if you want to dance around the maypole and have a fertility rites, and go for it. And it's a political act. Remember that. Everything is political.
Yep.
The ruling class does not want you dancing and enjoying fertility. So,
and I feel like the following, 400 or 500 years of history has really proven who the real savages of the time were.
Absolutely. And if we really wanted to get into it, there's some stuff going on in England around the same time with like the diggers and the levelers, which is really freaking cool stuff. We should do a show on that sometime, because there's this long history. Like, the diggers became a motivation, kind of for the San Francisco crowd, like the Bay Area left, the
beatniks,
counterculture, the beatniks and stuff. Yeah. And then the levelers are just like really cool. They wanted to level society. So anyway, there's this maypole, even though it's kind of seen as this pagan ritual, this fertility rite, actually did have political meaning, but that's not what we're talking about today. Really, we're going into the 1880s when, and the well, as you know, it's not Labor Day in the United States. I think, is it the US and Canada who don't celebrate it on this day?
Yeah, I believe so.
Pretty much
Definitely the US
does. Yeah. Now, in the old days, remember when Eastern European was around, we could have had a green and red May Day and had like all the tanks and all our armor and armies marching down the street like they did in, the old Soviet Union. May Day became kind of a holiday to show off, their national military pride.
The trucks with the missiles is what I
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. But in reality, in the May Day, even though it's not celebrated in the United States, in many ways is an American creation from the 1880s. And you can give us that lesson.
Yep. So what I'll say, talking about one of our constant themes is the conflict between the rabble and the ruling class. Is, the 1880s and 1890s were some of the most turbulent political times in US history. And in 1886, Chicago anarchists organized a mass march, basically fighting for the 8-hour workday. And on May 1st, 1886, tens of thousands of unemployed workers marched down the streets of Chicago as part of a nationwide general strike, which is also something you don't see in the US. We're seeing that in places like India and Brazil and places where they're fighting some of these, very authoritarian governments, but we're not really seeing that happen in the US in a long time.
In 1877, you had seen that. There was a national strike in 1877, and that kind of gave impetus to left unions like the Knights of Labor, which was a left union, obviously, in those days. And so Haymarket is kind of a continuation of that. And the ruling class was, not happy with what had happened after the national strike, and clearly with the rise of the Knights of Labor, who claimed to have close to 1 million members.
Right.
And so there's this national movement for an 8-hour day. There's also a strike going on. I don't want to cut into your thing. I don't know if you were going to mention that, but there's a strike. There was a strike in Chicago at the McCormick Works, which made farm equipment, and they brought scabs in, and it had gotten violent, in late April, early May.
Right. And it resulted in a demonstration on May 4th in Chicago at Haymarket Square, where the police ended up firing on the crowd and killing a number of people. And 8 Chicago anarchists were arrested in that melee. I believe some police got killed, but they were arrested for crimes they didn't commit. And 4 of the 8 were hung. One of the martyrs was Albert Parsons, who is the husband of Lucy Parsons, who's actually a noted Texas anarchist. She's from actually East Texas, who was an accomplished anarchist writer and orator. And so what on the history of Mayday, what this leads to is a few years later in 1889, the Marxist International Socialist Congress, which met in Paris and had established the Second International as a successor to an earlier body, which we could talk about someday in the future, called the International Working Men's Association, basically declared May Day a holiday. And part of it was as a tribute to the Haymarket martyrs. And that's when it became an official holiday, known as International Workers' Day.
Well, not in the United States.
Except in the United States.
Other countries started to, but in the US, it was associated obviously with the socialists. So the United States wasn't going to tolerate that. Although among working people, there was a radical labor movement in the US. I think we've said this before, between 1877 and, these are kind of arbitrary figures, but not really. 1877 was the year of the national strike. And 1937 was the year of the Little Steel Strike. And you have a 60-year period there. Is that 60 years? Yeah, 60 years. No, it's like 37 and 23.
50.
37 and 23. No, it's 60.
Oh, okay.
77 to 37. Anyway, Bob and Scott do math.
Advanced math, high math.
Yeah. I often call that the period of class war, because protest and agitation and struggle in the United States doesn't have that kind of clear class character often, like you'll see in other industrialized countries, Europe and so forth. But in that period, that 60-year period, it's actually, this is the period, Haymarket, Homestead, Pullman, Ludlow, Blair Mountain, all the way through Flint and the Little Steel Strikes. So this is kind of
Bloody Harlan was in that period.
Harlan. This is the heyday of often violent, actually, class conflict in the U.S. After World War II, you don't really see that, because military Keynesianism kind of not necessarily in a bad way, buys off labor and gives them decent wages and things like that. And then, and we can talk about this at the end, then I think identity politics becomes the main character of the left, and they're dealing with issues that are not necessarily class and workplace based. So, and I will offend people when we get to that point. So.
Yeah. And then one other thing I'll say is that like I said, the 1880s and 1890s were a very turbulent political period in U.S. history, very related to radical anarchists, but also very much because of the labor movement. And so in the 1890s, it was actually in the lead up to the 1896 election, the Congress, and then signed by President Grover Cleveland, actually passed what was known as the federal Labor Day holiday, which actually happens in September. There's a couple of different theories around why he passed it, but definitely what was happening in the backdrop to this is that we had like the 1894 Pullman strike, when 125,000 workers across 29 railroads walked off the job to protest wage cuts, right? And so it's also the period of the populists. We're seeing lots of strikes. We're seeing lots of turmoil. And so the theory is that the government was basically trying to quell this political dissent, and then also discourage the working class from organizing against their Gilded Age oppressors. There's also thoughts that the idea of Labor Day, of the official Labor Day holiday, that one that's the first Monday of September, came from laborers. Peter McGuire, who was founder of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters, and an early AFL, American Federation of Labor, leader. And then it was also suggested that the Central Labor Union in New York actually had a lot to do with the emergence of that. And so there's a couple of different theories about it, but it's very clear that part of this was to appease this rowdy labor movement, which was, this is the beginning of what Bob just described.
And it's also a way to create a wedge, a cleavage, because so many of these major labor agitators in that era weren't native born. This is a period, obviously, of great immigration. And so you had a lot of workers coming in, especially early on from like Germany, who were, had this radical tradition. Later in the 20th century, be Italians who were heavily, educated in an anarchist tradition. And so, Mayday was a big deal among labor in the late 19th century. There were big Mayday celebrations and parties, and I don't know if they put up a maypole and danced with the Pequot or anything like that, but it was actually a big deal. And so the other thing that was very clever actually was by saying, well, that's a European holiday, that's a foreign holiday. And, you create this wedge between American workers and these native born workers. And, they were called terrorists. That's not a new term by any means. You see that term used like at Haymarket in 1877, these foreign born terrorists and so on. And so America has its own Labor Day. We're not like those crazy immigrants and those dirty anarchist immigrants, and that
Bolsheviks,
and that plays into things even as into like the 1920s with Sacco and Vanzetti, that idea that white workers were turned against Sacco and Vanzetti because they were Italian anarchists. So this is also really important, and we're seeing this now. We just did a couple shows on the Amazon strike, right, where you saw kind of cleavages emerge based on non-class related factors, whether it be age and seniority, or and Black Lives Matter came in and was kind of trying to take a role in that, and it was a disaster. The union just got thrashed. So, but yeah, it's also a way to kind of create this kind of uniquely American holiday and to kind of prize American culture over these Europeans who were coming in out of a guild tradition, out of a tradition of anarchy. It was a way to say the Wobblies were un-American. And this is the same time, remember, when the government's going after Wobblies, they're getting them arrested. They're killing people like Frank Little and Joe Hill. So it has a clear political meaning. Yeah.
And it should be noted that in the legislation that they actually passed is that they were creating this federal holiday, this federal Labor Day, as a tribute to the greatest the greatest worker in the world, the American worker.
Yeah.
Right. And, it's very much like wrapping it in the flag and very much looking to divide workers against each other, native born versus immigrant, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, that is in 2021 still happens.
Oh, yeah. Build that wall.
Build that wall. And so moving forward a little bit, fast forwarding in the 1920s, Labor Day became, or May 1st became known as Americanization Day. They continued to try and put a wedge in the heart of this more radical labor movement, and so they officially called May 1st Americanization Day, which was a holiday of forced patriotism conceived after the 1917, still on the Jimmy Carter kick, 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and also dealing with the renewed current of militancy within the American labor movement. Like towards the end of World War I, in the late teens and early 20s, was when we saw this a period known as I believe it was the first Red Scare, where the government, the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, all emerged going after wobblies, going after radical anarchists, going after radical immigrants, after people who agreed with Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolshevik Revolution. And Americanization Day existed from, continued in, it was known as that from 1921 to 1958, when we get into the McCarthy period.
Well, remember last year we talked to Cal Winslow. There was a general strike in Seattle, a huge general strike in Seattle in 1919. The Bolshevik Revolution was actually looked at as kind of a model, like, they were very favorable. And didn't like a Russian ship came in and they were feted with, a banquet and vodka and all kinds of stuff like that. So yeah, that, even though it wasn't official, there were certainly significant pockets of labor that continued to celebrate May 1st and to continue to have that radical tradition. And you'll see that, when the CIO, gets created later, it's going to have significant communist influence. The best organizers were the communists and people on the left, and who eventually had to be kind of, removed. So yeah, there is that. I mean, I think, and when we've talked about this before, I do think Americans on the left have a habit of romanticizing a lot of this stuff. Like every time 5 people got together and, had a rally, it became like class struggle. And the reality is the ruling class crushed these movements. But, there was a kind of a widespread and vigorous resistance all over urban areas, places like Haymarket and Pullman, in the farmers, right? The populists who could be quite radical, coal miners in West Virginia, which was the site of the biggest labor conflict in US history. It was, at the time, I think the second biggest conflict, like right after World War I or something like that. They 3,000 Army troops.
Yeah, it's the second largest armed insurrection in US history after the Civil War, after the Confederacy.
Yeah, we'll have to see how the Capitol riots stack up to that.
Yeah, exactly.
But at Blair Mountain, there was the good guys who were rebelling. So, but yeah, no, there's this long, like I call it, the class wars era. For 60 years, you had, hardcore resistance. They were like, what was the Honea massacre? I could go on and on and on and on. But this stuff is occurring, all over the country in industrial areas and agricultural areas. You have ethnic groups like the Italians in the 1920s who are, Palmer, that's one of the main targets of the Palmer raids. These Italians who are, these people are arrested, no charges filed, no legal proceedings, and they're just deported or jailed. That's where the phrase
killed.
Yeah, and the anarchists are where the phrase "no gods, no masters" came from. We should have worn our Mayday appropriate shirts today. I didn't think of that. All right. So, I have my "Get In, Loser, We're Seizing the Means of Production" shirt up there, which is covering up a cabinet that has cleaning products in it. So,
in 1955, which was at the peak of the anti-communist Red Scare, led by the junior senator from Wisconsin,
Ron Johnson.
Kind of. I'm sure he's, praised to a picture of this person every night.
I actually think the GOP. I think McCarthy might have been embarrassed by Ron Johnson.
Yeah, that's true. But it's very true. But it's, the Red Scare that's helmed by Joseph McCarthy passes a resolution deeming May 1st, as Loyalty Day, which was, to counter the impact of May Day rallies going on around the globe. When we talk about the troops and tanks and missiles and things like that through Red Square and that sort of thing. And it became actually an official holiday, which means that Eisenhower signed it in 1958. And that's, Americanization Day from 1921 to 1958. And then 1958, it becomes Loyalty Day. But like Bob was saying, the purpose of Americanization Day and Loyalty Day and even that federal Labor Day holiday is that the U.S. government had a interest in quashing dissent and cracking down on radical political organizers. And so also when we talk about the various Red Scares, and there's a number of them, everyone's familiar with the McCarthyite Red Scare, but there were, they go back to the early 20s. We talk about the Palmer raids, and then kind of post McCarthy era, we see things like COINTELPRO, which we've actually also had shows on where they targeted the New Left and the Black Panthers, et cetera. And the purpose is to clamp down on radical dissent, on radical organizing. And that's sort of the message here, is that like the government and the ruling class are really happy when we have some dissent, but when it gets too radical and they want, to move things too far to the left, when it becomes too big, when it becomes, undermining of their authority and their power, then they look for ways to quash it. And so we've seen 20-something million people on the streets since the murder of George Floyd, everything from, mutual aid groups to backcountry campaigns against pipelines to, large numbers of people in the street either against Trump or against the police. Make no mistake, even though they are very clearly going after the right and the the people behind the Capitol riots, they're also looking pretty hard at people on the left.
Yeah. It also, and another theme we brought up is, and I think people have to understand, there's clearly a history of violent repression in the United States, but it's actually pretty, I don't want to say minimal, but it's definitely not as significant as it is in many other places, because the ruling class has like countless strategies. So like it will send people, we saw that last summer, right? And I think that's why the ruling class turned on Trump, because it became very destabilizing when violence became kind of the main and first resort, actually, in many of these regards. But something like Mayday is a great example of kind of a non-violent approach to containing. When I talk about the Cold War, you're familiar with the policy of containment, which was Kennan's idea about containing the Soviet Union, not letting communism extend beyond Eastern Europe. But there's containment at home too. And that containment at home is actually about democracy, because after World War II, you have significant groups, African Americans probably the best example, but labor as well, who want to extend the American conception of democracy, women, all these other groups.
Women's movements.
And so generally that's not done via violence and force. It's done via these kind of more, what Gramsci would say, cultural means, right? And so Labor Day is a key component of that, by saying, we're going to give you your own holiday, and we appreciate you, we respect you, we'll honor your work, you're a vital part of American society, but you're not like those May 1st Labor Day people, right? And to be fair, I mean, the Eastern Europeans, the Soviet Union, the communist countries kind of used it for their own purposes too. I mean, Labor Day, May Day was not intended to be a show of military force, where, everybody's in Red Square or wherever, and which is, I think, actually a desecration of the original purpose of it as well. But, at the same time, I don't want to go off on a huge rant, but there's a difference between the way workers are handled in these socialist or communist countries and in the United States too. There's social welfare programs and things like that. So Labor Day, I would argue, and this is the kind of thing that gets me in trouble with my colleagues, is like, I would actually May Day is more genuine, in those socialist places than it is, like in the United States. So,
I mean, the September federal Labor Day holiday is essentially about beaches and barbecues.
It's about shopping, Labor Day
shopping.
sales, and going to the beach one last time, and it gets commodified, absolutely, like like most labor things are.
And it was a different commodification strategy, but like even today, like to watch Hulu, right? There's like Hulu commercials about supporting Black Lives Matter movements, right? Yeah. Which is like, sign up for the Hulu mailing list so you can learn how to help do things on, on these matters of racial justice, et cetera. And it's the, it's just the 2021 version of the cultural commodification. And this also brings another point that we wanted to talk about today, is that another strategy that the ruling class and the liberal class actually have against the left, because what we're talking about here is just this constant war against the left, against radical organizing, against radical politics, is we also have liberal intellectuals and liberal historians, which also work to undermine even the history of those original, Chicago Mayday anarchists. And so what I'm talking about here is there's actually a liberal labor historian, I believe, from the University of Rhode Island, who actually tweets quite a bit and blogs and writes quite a bit about how, the anarchists of the 1880s actually destroyed the Knights of Labor, things like that. His name's Eric Loomis. And it's also it's another strategy, which is they have this liberal intellectual group of people, which also just like constantly works to like hammer on that. I don't know. Yeah. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, Bob.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually began my historical training as a labor historian and at Ohio State with the great Warren Van Tine. He's a great guy. And so I actually know a little bit about labor history, as my critics would say, damn little. But yeah, and there are significant people like Loomis and a good friend of mine who teaches at Collin College, in fact. Chad Pearson has written extensively. He's a really good labor historian, and he talks about this. And I'm on this like email list with mostly labor historians, where he'll often, kind of put this stuff out there. And that's how I found about the Loomis tweet, where he just attacked the Wobblies and the anarchists, and he attacked Emma Goldman. And there are significant, and the point here is that you do have radical historians, absolutely, but you do have this like important cadre of liberal historians who praise like this kind of the business unionism. I'm being a professor here for a minute, so humor me. In the United States, there was a significant element of radicalism in the labor movement. Like the Pullman strike was led by Eugene Debs, right, who would later be a socialist candidate for president of the American Railway Union. So you had significant radical elements and significant pockets of radicalism in the labor movement. But then the dominant labor movement beginning in the later 19th and 20th century would be the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, which believed in business unionism, or unionism pure and simple, which meant you want higher wages, you want better working conditions, you negotiate that, right? So you have a group like the Wobblies, which is about resistance at the point of production, direct action. I think people don't realize, like during the Alabama union drive recently, you don't need to be in a union to go on strike. In fact, it's not uncommon in this era to have a strike in order to get a union. Like non-unionized people would go on strike in order to have a union recognized. And one of the key things you do when you do get a union, you sign a union contract, and remember Stott and Lynn talked about this in like the second show we ever did, was essentially you forgo your strike, your right to go on strike. So this is one of the things about American labor is not a radical labor, does not have a radical labor tradition, right? And until, I guess like Thatcher, you did see that in things like the British labor movement. And, even in France, you have, huge numbers of people going out in the streets, the yellow vest and things like that. You don't really have that in the United States. Last year, we had this massive kind of spontaneous uprising, but it wasn't per se about labor issues, although COVID had a huge part to play in that, all the economic problems associated with COVID. But getting back to the original point, yeah, you have a significant cadre of these kind of liberal or mainstream historians who are, kind of favorably inclined toward labor, but they believe in this kind of AFL, kind of liberal notion of labor. You should have unions, they should be recognized, they should be able to, negotiate, collectively bargain, but don't go too far. Don't be like the Wobblies, don't be like, Emma Goldman, don't be like Debs, don't be like Sacco Vanzetti, because the idea there, which you've heard way more than me, is, you're hurting the cause, right? Like America, there's this idea that, American public opinion is just waiting there. It's like the defund the police movement, right? Well, defund the police is turning people off, They don't say anything about like the fact that the police are killing multiple people and beating multiple people every day. The focus becomes defund the police. And in that regard, rather than focus on the way that bosses are using these countless strategies sometimes violent, but more often than not, they go to court. They can use their economic power. They have the media behind them. They can divide workers based on things like ethnic origins. Instead of talking about that, they'll focus on, the anarchists that Haymarket. I mean, the prelude to Haymarket was this McCormick strike, where the National Guard and private militias killed workers, killed strikers. And so, Loomis could have said, well, that's the problem. It wasn't the anarchists. It was the fact that McCormick had these goons killing people. And in the same way as today, you could say, well, the problem is that the police keep beating up 73-year-old women with dementia and giving a brain bleed to a 75-year-old guy and shooting a guy in the back, or shooting a 13-year-old kid after he dropped a gun, or putting your knee on somebody in California. That go on and on.
Or Minneapolis, yeah.
No, well, it just happened in California too.
Oh, I know, it happened here.
Yeah. I mean, guy had lost consciousness after 6 minutes. So, and he was public drunkenness, I think, or something like that, right? So you have the extrajudicial killings, but instead of focusing on liberals don't focus on the police, they focus on the defund the police movement. And in the same way, you see a lot of that, which is one reason the American labor movement is really, kind of docile compared to what it had been, and it purged those left elements. The CIO, for instance, by, part of the compact of World War II, because labor did very well during World War II. They got all these contracts, and during the war, they said, we're not going to ask for pay raises and stuff. By 1944, there were major strikes, and then you had Taft-Hartley. But at the same time, in the 1950s, American workers, that was their heyday. They were paid well. They got enough money, they could buy a house, they could, go on vacation, they could send their kids to college. So that was a compact. But the other part of that is getting rid of the communist organizers in the CIO, and getting rid of elements that might kind of come out of that May 1st tradition, rather than that first weekend in September, let's go to the beach and buy stuff at the mall tradition.
Yeah, one thing I want to say.
Loomis is a nitwit anyway. He compares himself to, people say I'm a Philip Marlowe character. I'm like, no offense, but if you have to do that to yourself, you're a tool. People say I'm a Tony Soprano character. Come on.
Real quick on that, folks. That's on Eric Loomis's Twitter bio, is how he compares himself to Philip Marlowe. Just that's what we're talking about. Just so you know, because we don't want to put his Twitter account on our show notes, because we don't want to elevate the nitwit, but just what we're talking about. One real quick thing too about this is some of the stuff that we touched on in some of the earlier shows early in our history, is this sort of there's this formula for corporate liberalism, and some of it is this docile labor movement. And so people like Eric Loomis, when they are, trying to disparage on Emma Goldman or Alexander Berkman or the, the Haymarket martyrs, is they're actually doing the bidding of the ruling class there. They are undermining, and it's very much, whatever you feel about Joe Biden and the Democrats, et cetera, this is actually, the Democrats don't like people in the streets. They probably like people in the streets less than the Republicans. And so people like Eric Loomis are doing everything they can to communicate to whatever audience they have. There's being in the streets actually is bad, right? You help destroy the Knights of Labor. We just need to kind of play this kind of bigger three-dimensional chess with the ruling class, because we're actually accepted into it. And C. Wright Mills actually wrote about some of the big labor leaders, et cetera, the union bosses being they're part of the formula.
Well, I mean, just last year, Hoffa, Trumka, and Weingarten were all on Trump's reopening committee for COVID. So yeah, there are pockets of very radical labor, and that's why we like talking to Mike Elk, who covers all of this stuff. We had Joe Allen on last year. So there have been offshoots like the Teamsters for a Democratic Union. So you have, even within unions, you have these elements. But the important issue here is how the ruling class, all these countless strategies that are not always violent. I mean, violence in the United States is probably less than in many places, because it doesn't need it, and it has these kind of cultural ways to do that, and it has, intellectuals are important. I mean, look at the people, you see who are the kind of experts on CNN or on these TV shows or in the newspapers. I used to, in the old days, I used to do a lot more media, and I remember I got called once by the McNeil Air or the subsequent thing. to talk, and they kind of did like a mini interview ahead of time, and I knew I wasn't going to be on because I didn't tell them what they wanted to hear. And then of course Michael Beschloss was on that night, who's a blockhead,
A liberal blockhead at that.
A liberal blockhead, and that's what they want. They want liberal blockhead. So Loomis is great, right? People who will go in there and say, it's the anarchist fault. It's not the police fault that they raided this peaceful rally and attack people. It's not the police fault that they beat people up on the line. It's not the police's fault that they're favoring private businesses and protecting scabs, right? Like Homestead was violent. The union opened fire and killed a bunch of scabs on Pinkertons on barges, and basically, even more than violence, what happened at Homestead was that the courts intervened. They said, they put injunctions into place where you couldn't strike, where you had to protect these scabs from coming in. And then they created a blacklist in the steel industry. So anybody who participated in the union at Homestead never worked again in the industry. And that's still true. I mean, I know people in Ohio who went on strike, and when those mills shut down, had a hell of a time finding another job because they were known as union agitators. And this is in like the 20th century, late 20th century. So, I mean, it's just important to remember this tradition and it speaks to so many other things. It's bigger, I think, than a labor issue. It talks about just kind of the way the left in the United States is designed and created. A couple of weeks ago Maxine Waters, I'm not a fan, let's just leave it at that. She's never really done anything, and she goes to Minnesota and says, we need to get into the streets, and it's almost like it's her version of burn baby burn, right? Which is a stupid freaking thing to say, because as a person who's been in the streets way more than I have, do you give a rat's ass what Maxine Waters says? Do people in the streets even know who she is, right? But it gives the right this ammunition, because she's just like this loudmouth agitator in their version of the story. And so
I'm sure repeated on Fox News at night.
Oh, it was all over the place.
24 hours.
It was all over the place. Yeah, nonstop. They wanted her to resign, all this kind of stuff. But for the most part, people in the streets, it's kind of do their own thing, and they're smarter than that. But that's kind of the same issues that are come out of Mayday. Right? How are you supposed to protest? Who is a legitimate dissenter and who isn't? And the state gets to decide all that, like you're not legit, but the people holding banners who get a permit to hold a banner at the street corner are.
Or Whole Foods who drops the banner over their entrance.
Yeah.
And just to be really clear, and this is something that we've been talking about a lot lately, is like, in many ways, corporate America is to the left of some of these like left institutions. Mm-hmm. And it's including like, huge parts of the labor movement. And so it's just a thing to note. And so like, if we're to the right of Coca-Cola and Delta and Whole Foods, which is owned by Amazon, then we need to, reassess our position on the spectrum.
Well, I think the very first show,
not you and I think we're pretty good, Bob, but other entities out there which
I've gone through a rigorous self-criticism. Kim Dao, the Vietnamese called it, and I think I am now theoretically flawless. So, but no, I think in the very first show,
people remark that to me often about you.
I'm theoretically flawless. Thanks. I work hard at it, and the humility is a big part of that.
Yeah.
The first show we ever did when we introduced the podcast, I think we specifically brought up the Georgia voting issue. This is in early February 20th, 2020. Again, showing how prescient we are. We are like so far ahead of the loop on all these issues, But at the time, I think
it's why we're in the top 10% of all podcasts.
Right. And that's why Coppola is talking to us about a film.
Joe Rogan should watch the fuck out.
That's right. We're coming after, and Pod Save America too. We're coming after both of you. No, but I remember at the time we were talking about like Stacey Abrams. I'm not going to criticize her at all. She's done really fantastic, great stuff. I mean, she flipped Georgia, which is really quite a feat. But at the same time, like, that's been done. That's a political movement, and she's a politician who wants to be governor, which is fine. But that's been done absent, any kind of real, like street action, right? Direct action, protest, sit-ins. And what we recently saw, and we did a show on it, I think is a really good example of that. Everybody knew. I mean, the GOP in Georgia has been suppressing votes for a long time. The fact that they could not win the election for Trump speaks volumes about the fact that Trump lost, right? Because if Georgia can't steal an election, nobody can. And so they're undergoing these like really brutal new voting laws, right? The worst of which the media isn't covering, which to me I think is the most terrifying, is that they would give the state legislature power over the elections commissions to certify elections. So, a Republican could lose 70-30, and the state legislature could, designate that person as the winner. And that's been done absent, any kind of really street action. They could have been barricading, areas going into the state house. They could have been occupying the offices of Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Republican legislatures. They did a little bit of Delta Airlines, but they could have gone heavy going after like Coca-Cola and Delta and, the Atlanta Braves and things like that.
A 10,000 person march through the streets of Atlanta would have had a huge impact. Even permitted, it would have had a huge impact.
And people love to use the civil rights movement as a framework. I mean, Martin Luther King wasn't signing move on petitions. They were violating the law and getting arrested like every time they went out. And so, absent that kind, and there's a real fear there that we don't want to be perceived as being too radical. And intellectuals like Loomis, we mentioned Michael Beschloss, Roy Teixeira, and the Center for American Progress, near a Tandon crowd, Thomas Burns Edsel, you just read the op-ed page of any paper,
and these are the intellectual wings of the Rahm Emanuels of the world, just to put that out there, who's part of the big problem.
What's funny is I used to get way more media inquiries, back. I mean, there's kind of a renascent resistance today, but I used to go on TV way more in the old days. I mean, I was not too long ago, I was on TV and talking about North Korea, when Trump was saber rattling. What was funny is they were doing a call-in poll. Do you think the United States and North Korea are going to go to war, or should go to war, or whatever? And I kind of was proud of myself because after my interview, like the majority of people in Houston, Texas said no, like North Korea is not a threat, right? So we have these majorities. And if I was looking at some polling today about Biden, who, and may I point this out, and I'm not a Joe Biden fan, but absent Medicare for all, which is a huge issue, what you're looking at right now is essentially a Bernie Sanders presidency, and I'm not saying that to praise Biden. I'm saying that to say that furor, that Jacobin-induced obsession and hysteria to the extent of everything else about Bernie Sanders, really, I think we see now, and you and I had talked about it while they were doing it, was really just a huge diversion of resources and time and energy from things like street actions, right? But, labor, we've done some shows on this, the Collin College professors who've been fired, right, just on a whim. And so the spirit of Mayday and the spirit of Haymarket is still very much alive. And we've shifted away from that idea on the left of class struggle. And now this is where I get trouble. We don't have to go in this direction. It's like, I think it's been replaced by this new focus on like identity and Twitter wars and going after somebody for writing a tweet when she was 17 years old and using that against her later in life. And I don't know, like James Carville, not one of my favorite people, wrote an article the other day, which I thought was actually pretty much spot on about wokeness. And we've talked a lot about that. Like woke capitalism is a real thing. And the problem with that, and we kind of, people always accuse me of being pro-corporate. And my point is that, absent a real resistance, that, they're doing an important job. I mean, somebody had to step up and say to Trump, you're not going to be president anymore. And it was Wall Street, because they called all those protests off on November 4th. And somebody had to go to the state of Georgia and say, there will be consequences if you do this. And it was Delta and American and United and Citibank and all these other, companies.
And now we're seeing stories about how, there are regular Zoom calls with, corporate leaders about how they are I mean, they're kind of framing it as like, we're going to cut off money to both parties, but the real money spigot that's being cut off is to the Republicans and to the far right crazies.
By all accounts, they're serious, because I figured by now they'd be back to their old ways, but they are still pushing this. I mean, Trump really was like the golden gift to people who blew it. They spent 4 years shrieking in terror. Trump is a fascist. There's going to be a coup. They were on the Paul dead end street, and the reality is that these people in the ruling class, and that was what you and I were telling people: chill out. It's going to be okay. If you're going to fucking have a coup, you better have the military and Wall Street and the corporate elite behind you. And those were Trump's biggest enemies, and unfortunately, I mean, I'm not gonna, I'm glad they're there. I'm glad they're doing it, because absent street action, street resistance, or the Democratic Party, right? That's kind of what we're getting. And in Georgia, in the spirit of Mayday, I really wish people would have gotten really, out there and agitated,
Yeah, I just want to say this one thing is that community organizing in communities is happening, like radical organizing in communities is happening. And after George Floyd, after the shooting in Kenosha, and then after Kyle Rittenhouse shooting 2 protesters in Kenosha, I mean, we saw a real left moment, like 25 million people in the streets, the NBA, teams striking, things of that nature. And what the intervention was from the ruling class was Obama convincing NBA players to not strike. It was the nonprofit industrial complex, which is in some ways, just the arm of the Democrats and the ruling class, basically, putting a lid on what was potentially going to be a lot more street actions in November. Like what the Democrats and the ruling class didn't want was November post-election to look like June. And that's what they worked towards. And so when all of those nonprofit organizations, labor unions, these milquetoast labor unions, were all part of the, let's respond if Trump stages a coup, which now we know is a little bit, it was just like it was smoke and mirrors. And so they worked to shut that down. Like there's legit street action happening. When tens of thousands of people were in the streets of Louisville, Kentucky after the murder of Breonna Taylor, going after the Louisville police, right? People getting charged with felonies, state legislatures who are Democrats, who are Democrats in Kentucky getting charged with felonies. Like that sort of thing was like, that's pretty important. The sort of conflict that it was like, this non-lethal conflict going on in the streets of Portland all the second half of last year, like really important stuff. And the Democrats who are, a mouthpiece of the ruling class, shut that shit down.
Yeah. And that's what
I don't want to disparage organizers, because I think this is just a lesson for organizers to take as we continue to organize and build our movements. This is like you have not lost. This is actually a sign of you winning, but you just need to be a little bit more aware of who your opponent is. It's not necessarily Trump.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge difference too between, let's say, the AFL-CIO or the United Mine Workers president and Helen Yost and Diane Wilson and Brian Paras and who are doing just amazing stuff. I mean, the ruling class would much rather have you studying Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi or Michael Eric Dyson than Cornel West, or, looking at the Black Agenda Report website or something like that. So they have this, facility. And I think anybody in academia who's been on the left, has felt this. I know, you don't have the same academic credibility, you don't have the same intellectual credibility. So the media would much rather talk to Michael Beschloss or Robert Dallek or Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is my particular bête noire, rather than people who, and then, I mean, we've talked at length about this too, that's one of our beefs about the New York left, right? They have their own cadre of in-house intellectuals and who they privilege, and most of whom come from a fairly small radius of Brooklyn. And so there are people in community colleges all over the country who are doing amazing work, and nobody ever hears about them. Nobody knows about them, and they write stuff and they say stuff, and like 6 months later, somebody from New York or writer say the exact same thing and be acclaimed as some kind of hero or genius, when in fact it's out there. So There is clearly, I mean, to a long-winded point to what you said, is there are people out there doing really good stuff, who are doing really radical stuff. And, I was struck the other day, Carville wrote a piece, about, kind of the problems of woke politics. And, I have to say, I agreed with pretty much all of it, or most of it, because there is this tendency, I love this phrase, faculty lounge politics, where this has seeped into the left to a fairly significant degree, where they're having, these large debates over, pronouns and language and, the prioritizing certain issues over the other. I'm not taking a position on any of these particular things, but like my only point would be, let's say J.K. Rowling, I'm not defending her at all, but the point is, J.K. Rowling is not on the list of the really important things, I think, that are out there, the problems that we have out there. I mean, she's not the big, if she were the biggest enemy we had, or the biggest problem we had, we'd won the lottery, And so I think a lot of people focus on that, or they get hung up like, I think, Carville had a point. People talk about communities of color, which sounds like kind of a hoity-toity phrase, instead of like, he's like, they're neighborhoods, right? I mean, I've said many times, come to Youngstown with me and go into a working class area and tell these people they have white privilege, because white privilege implies everybody, has this, and they get very upset over phrases like that. And, Trump's people, there's clearly a racist element. Absolutely. You can't deny that. But a big part of that is this anti-elitism, right? And that's part of the ruling class's plan, right? Instead of Mayday, we have Labor Day, is I think kind of a continuation, as a continuation of that. But stuff's going on. I mean, the Amazon strike didn't turn out well, but you have the strike now, the coal strike in Alabama, which is, the union bosses negotiated a settlement and the rank and file turned it down. So that's going on. You did have, I think, some labor action in getting the All-Star game moved from Georgia, which I think was useful. So, but historically, I think it's important to understand why some people on the left talk about Mayday. It's more than a pagan holiday, or if you're Catholic, it's actually the month of the Blessed Mother Mary. Mayday is, if you're Catholic, is celebrated. It's more than that. It's actually a holiday to celebrate radical labor resistance, and it's created out of a time when anarchists and socialists really were important in the labor movement, and class struggle was a real thing. Violent class struggle was a real thing, and it wasn't just one-sided from the top down. So, if you're, thank those guys and women from Blair Mountain and from Ludlow and from Bisbee and all those other places.
Bloody Harlan
and Pullman and Homestead.
Which our closing outro today is going to be a little tune from Bloody Harlan. Florence Reese, Which Side Are You On? Yeah, and today is May Day. Today is probably a lot, there's probably a lot of people, there are a lot of people in the streets today, whether they're for migrant rights or labor or anti-capitalist. And so we also want to just pay tribute to those folks, because, there's some places where I'm sure the May Day parade is going to get violent because the police don't like people in the streets. But you've been listening to the Green and Red podcast and talking about Mayday and the politics of Mayday. This was a really important and good conversation we just had. And if you want to continue to learn more about the Green and Red podcast, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can watch this episode and many other episodes on YouTube, and just hit that subscribe button to help us out. And then donate to us on our website, greenandredpodcast.org, and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And so here is the original Which Side Are You On by Florence Reese.
Happy May Day to everybody, and hasta la victoria siempre.
Happy May Day, comrades.
Come all you poor workers, good news to you I'll tell, how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? We're starting our good battle, we know we're sure to win, because we've got the gun thugs looking very thin. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? If you go to Harlan County, there is no neutral there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? They say they have to guard us to educate their child. Their children live in luxury, our children almost wild. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Gentlemen, can you stand it? Oh, tell me how you can. Will you be a gun thug or will you be a man? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? My daddy was a miner, he's now in the iron sun. He'll be with you fellow workers till every battle's won. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?